Welcome everybody, welcome to CUHK Law, welcome to this week's Greater China Legal History Seminar. It's my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker for today, whom I don't really have to introduce, my friend and colleague, Professor Steve Gallagher, who is here at CUHK Law, a professor of practice in law, and almost more importantly, also our associate dean teaching and learning. Steve's research interests are property law, legal history, of course, art, antiques, cultural heritage law, and he also has a special interest in teaching techniques and legal education. Again, Steve has widely published. He is a frequent speaker around the world on topics in his areas of expertise. And it's no surprise that today's seminar has attracted the largest number of registrations for this year's Greater China Legal History Seminar Series. So well done, Steve. I'll hand over to you in a minute. Steve will talk today about toppling statues and changing names. Does the law protect embarrassing or awkward heritage in Hong Kong? Before I pass the floor to the speaker, let me please remind you that you can, as always in our seminars, chat in questions that you might have, which we will then pass to the speaker at the end of the seminar. Use the chat function, please, and then we will hopefully have a good discussion at the end. But without further ado, over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Lutz, and thank you for the generous introduction. Let me just share my screen if I can. There we go. And I'll show you my slides. I've got rather a few slides, so I will try to get through them as quickly as possible to try and leave some time for questions at the end. Good to start with a photograph of one of our famous local statues, one of the twin lions outside the HSBC building in Central. I'm never too sure if this is Stephen or Stitt, the two lions. We'll come back to those a little bit later on. So today I'm going to talk about statues, names, cultural heritage. I'll start off talking about the terms very briefly. Then I'll talk about the problems that there are with statues. When historically statues have been toppled, names have been changed, and cultural heritage has been removed. Why statues are toppled, why they're effaced, defaced, refaced, and names are changed, because all of these things go on with statues and other manifestations of heritage at times. Then we'll just briefly, is the loss of statues, names, and cultural heritage actually an issue? Then move on, hopefully very quickly, into the threats to statues, names, and cultural heritage in Hong Kong itself. Legal protection for statues and names in Hong Kong. Issues that arose in colonial Hong Kong and what the record was like protecting heritage in colonial Hong Kong, what happened after 1997, and most importantly, what happened in 2007, where we had big changes in Hong Kong, well, things that affected people's recognition of heritage in Hong Kong. Then something on the new statues that have appeared in Hong Kong and the future for Hong Kong's colonial heritage. So the terms that we'll be using, statues, names, but also cultural heritage, of course. So best place to look for a good summary today is Wikipedia. The Dean knows how much I trust Wikipedia. So here we have a definition of a statue. A statue is a freestanding sculpture in which the realistic full-length figures of persons or animals or non-representational forms are carved or cast in a durable material such as wood, metal, or stone. I would say that today, of course, other materials are used. Typical statues are life-sized or close to life-size, a sculpture that represents persons or animals in full figure, but that is small enough to lift and carry as a statuette or a figurine, while one more than twice life-size is a colossal statue. And of course, we've all seen examples of these. If we go to any of the museums or tombs in China or in Asia generally, we'll see statues. These tomb warriors are often virtually life-size, so statues usually being life-size. Another statue, which is very much life-size, is a chance to plug a property law seminar upcoming on the 3rd of February, when a lawyer from the Netherlands will be talking to us about this particular figure. This is a statue of a monk We know that it's life-size because the monk is inside this particular statue. So this mummified monk figure will be discussed on the 3rd of February in one of our seminars. Statuettes, of course, these small size statues, portable, often displayed in homes. And of course, colossal statues. Many of us will have visited some of these colossal statues. Again, some very famous ones in China as well. This one in Chengdu that I visited at the beginning of last year. Also, we have to remember that there are architectural sculptures as well, sculptures on buildings. So here we have our old Supreme Court building, which of course has a figure of always identified as justice on the top. It's the Greek goddess Themis. And of course, just below that, interestingly, of course, is the royal coat of arms of the British royal family as well. So the old Supreme Court building, examples of architectural sculpture. I'm using the term at times cultural heritage. I thought I'd just quickly explain what I meant. Cultural heritage is a term of international law, but I think there is a popular meaning, and the popular meaning I usually use is this. Cultural heritage is evidence of the activities and achievements of humankind that should be passed on for the benefit of future generations. Statues and names, of course, may be cultural heritage, and often they are cultural heritage, identified as different forms, but probably coming within that general definition there. They're evidence of achievements, but I've also put in the word activities because not all cultural heritage is good. There's also some dark cultural heritage or embarrassing cultural heritage, and many of us will have seen examples of this again in Asia. If you visited the Genocide Museum in Cambodia, you know, these are examples of heritage, of things being preserved to remind us of dark times in humankind's history as well. Embarrassing heritage in Hong Kong, well, we've got our own examples. Many of you may have visited this particular nunnery in the New Territories. I'm not too sure if it is still there. There was a plan to actually develop this particular area. The nunnery itself, not too important. What's behind the nunnery is very important. And some of you will have visited this. This is the Martyrs Grave. And this, of course, is a grave which is meant to contain, we're not too sure how many remains of people who took part in the resistance against the British when they entered the New Territories in 1899. Indigenous villagers who did not accept that the British were coming in peacefully and didn't want the British coming in. There was a 6-day war, and apparently the majority of the people who died, the indigenous villagers' side, were buried in this particular grave. It's an example of that sort of embarrassing heritage because it's often been forgotten, it's often been overlooked. It was maintained by the nunnery, but you know, the British at the time were embarrassed about what happened. The indigenous villagers were embarrassed about what happened. No one really wanted to remember. There was a move in 1996 to clean up the grave, and there were the ideas that there would be celebrations in 1997, but even the PRC didn't really want to remember about this, and things passed very quietly. We'll come back to those sorts of issues later. So the problem for statues, I think, has been highlighted by some very famous recent issues. In the last 20 years, of course, probably the most famous was to do with the statues of the Buddha in Bamiyan in Afghanistan. And again, you may remember back in the beginning of 2001, pictures came out, film came out of these Buddhas being destroyed by the Taliban. Various reasons put forward for the destruction. The idea that these were idols, and of course these are Muslim fundamentalists, and they do not accept that there should be any representation of human forms, especially of other idols. And of course, other issues linked into what was going on in Afghanistan at the time. It attracted international condemnation. It attracted statements from UNESCO, from the Yuen, the international community condemning this particular action. And it's interesting to contrast this, and a number of people have recently, the attitudes of the international community to the destruction of this particular statues and what's gone on with other statues around the world in more recent times. The fact that the international community has often stayed very quiet about the removal of those particular statues. Also, of course, we've seen incidences of linked to, again, terrorism and movements like Daesh in Iraq in destroying monuments and statues, which again attracted lots of international attention. In fact, of course, these particular groups realized how much attention they would get for this and would film themselves doing these things and put the films out on YouTube so that people could watch. If you're worried about the destruction of these statues, don't worry too much, because quite a few of them were actually copies. And if you want to see the real ones, you can go to the British Museum and see some of the real ones there. Ignore the idiot standing in front of the figures there, but that's another interesting issue with statues that we'll talk about a little bit later on. For me, the main focus, the interest in statues, it came about because of the course I teach on our master's degree on art, antiquities, cultural heritage and the law, particularly in 2017, because this was a year when many things happened, particularly in the United States, to do with statues. And I was very lucky that in that particular year, I had a group of students on exchange in my class from the Cardozo Law School in New York. And they wanted to talk about this. And of course, as is the usual case with all of us who teach at universities, it was great for me because I learned more from the students than I think they learned from me about this. But we got to discuss these statues and the issues that went on. So you may remember a number of issues to do with these statues, particularly of Confederate heroes linked to slavery. Again, this was mainly a sort of issues to do with those who were against slavery, contrasting with what were referred to as the white supremacist groups as well. This is a statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, became a focus for a lot of demonstrations from both groups, vandalism of the statue as well. At one point, the statue was covered up, and then, of course, a court ordered that the statue should be uncovered as well. And of course, the troubles in Charlottesville eventually culminated, of course, in a lady losing her life in these riots that went on there. So this is how bad the issues with statues have been in the United States. It continued with many statues. This again was one of my sort of most interesting stories for me. This is the statue of Theodore Roosevelt outside the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And you can see here it's been defaced by paint, it's been thrown all over the pedestal. The protesters, who called themselves the Monument Removal Brigade, were demanding that the statue should be removed. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, very famous president of America, but expressed views particularly to do with Native Americans, which were considered unacceptable today, are considered unacceptable today. So the idea was this should be removed. In fact, these particular groups were demonstrating outside the museum and saying, you need to remove this particular statue. The museum responded in a typical way that a lot of public bodies have when they've been faced with this issue. They quickly pointed out that it's not their statue. They said, it may be outside our museum, but that's actually public ground. It doesn't belong to us. It's nothing to do with us. So they tried to disclaim all sort of responsibility for it. And earlier in 2020, in June 2020, they actually asked the local authority for the statue to be removed as well. Now, they've received criticism from those who are actually saying, we need to protect statues. We need to protect these statues, however uncomfortable they make us feel. And there's a lot in the museum industry, if you like to call it that, who've actually said that the museum should have stood up and said, no, we need to protect this. Maybe we need to do something else in the display of the statue. But disclaiming it and trying to pass the buck to someone else is not really the best way to deal with these problems. One of the incidents that the students who in my class were really very interested in was this. Again, I don't know if many people remember, this is Fredericksbure in the United States. And this is a block which is in the middle of the town, which is reputed to be an auction block upon which, as it says there, in pre-Civil War days, slaves and property, you could almost say, and other property, of course, was sold. So this is an auction block, which is said to be for slaves. Now, there is a dispute about this. Some people have said it's actually just a mountain block for people to get on horses, but this is the placard that's against it. It's remembered as an auction block for people. And it became a focus of a lot of dispute about whether it should be preserved or whether it should be removed. I put a couple of comments in. The local mayor, she said, we're talking about what is history. We are not talking about a memorial or something that is after the fact or glorification. This is the history. That is the spot. This is the significant distinction. But a local councilman, and we should note that he's also described as a Civil War reenactor in the description in the reports. Matt Kelly said, the point that a lot of people make when they look at the block is that it makes them feel uncomfortable. Frankly, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We feel uncomfortable because it represents something that we never want to see again. Hopefully it reinforces in us the sense that we all have a role in making sure that it never happens again. And that's been a big argument in trying to preserve some of these monuments, these statues around the world. Of course, there is another view as well, which is a view that doesn't always get expressed Here we have a local city council member who says, I personally don't need something like that to remind me of what my ancestors had endured. If you want healing, why would you continue to leave obstacles in place that remind you of the suffering? You can't heal if you always have the reminder. So there are lots of different views about these things. Other issues have involved things like frescoes. It's not just statues, it's not just 3D representations. We've also got two-dimensional representations as well. So the Washington High School in San Francisco has an issue with this fresco on its walls, which portrays the life of George Washington, and of course represents Black Americans and Native American Indians in ways that again are considered unacceptable today. So there have been calls to actually remove this particular fresco. It wasn't just in the USA as well. Of course, it came outside in 2017. It even hit monuments in my old hometown in London. And there were calls for the removal of this statue. So many of you who visited London will have been to Trafalgar Square. You will know that it's quite an imposing classical square. And the main focus, of course, being on Britain's foremost naval hero, Admiral Lord Nelson. And here's the column with the figure on the top. In 2017, a journalist published an article in which she claimed that Nelson had been very friendly with people who owned slaves and had in some ways promoted and protected them, and therefore his statue should be removed. And that received a lot of attention. A lot of people, of course, opposing this, pointing out that, you know, Nelson himself didn't own any slaves, maybe he had friends who were slavers, but was this really a reason to get rid of a statue of England's foremost naval hero? But some, of course, would keep on referring to him as a white supremacist. I think those in favour of retaining the statue would point out, of course, that, you know, 1805, when Nelson died, shortly afterwards, 1807, we get the abolition of slavery in England. 1833, we get the Slavery Abolition Act, which abolishes slavery throughout the British Empire. But again, there were still lingering examples of slavery throughout the British Empire. Other people have pointed out as well that as a hero of the British Navy, once the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act had been through, the British Navy then spent a lot of time patrolling the waters of West Africa and actually trying to stop the continuation of the West African slave trade. So that's a flip side to the argument for the removal. The journalist in question, by the way, has at one point said that she was probably putting this forward more to draw attention to the whole issue than actually trying to remove the statue, to get the debate going about these historical figures and their representations. The arguments reached all around the world. Of course, in Australia, there are issues to do with Captain Cook and other colonial heroes. The indigenous populations again saying that, you know, there were lots of terrible things that happened with the founding of Australia. And of course, it even entered into other discussions. Again, in 2017, there were calls in India by the Hindu majority ruling party, by certain characters within that, for the removal of the Taj Mahal. Because, of course, the Taj Mahal was built by a Muslim ruler of India, and it was said that this did not represent the cultural heritage of India. Again, sometimes there is a question about how serious these proposals are, or whether it is just to attract attention. More recently, there have been issues with the erection of new statues as well, even when we might think that a new statue, there is a good reason for erecting it. So in 2019, Britain's second female prime minister unveiled a statue to Britain's first female MP. So Britain's second female prime minister unveils a statue of Britain's first female MP. So this is a statue of Nancy Astor. And again, lots of people celebrating and saying she was a pioneer in many ways, although in some ways she did become the MP by way of first female MP by way of default, because there was another female MP who couldn't take her seat or wouldn't take a seat because of her particular political party. But anyway, the statue was unveiled, and then again, very shortly afterwards was defaced because, of course, Nancy Astor expressed some views which are considered to be unacceptable. Even at the time, they were considered to be unacceptable. So let's think about the reasons and what's happened in the past in historically toppling statues and changing names and removing cultural heritage. There is a long history of this. there's been a long history of the destruction of statues and other cultural heritage. It's usually to do with regime changes, sometimes as soon as statues are erected. So hopefully many people will have visited Xi'an and seen the terracotta army in the tomb of the first emperor. But if you have, you will know that the tomb was broken into, this area of the tomb was broken into very soon after everything was buried. And the weapons that would have been with the figures, many of them were taken away. And of course, some of the figures were destroyed, and actually a fire was set in places to try and destroy some of the figures. Again, as soon as one regime ends, the new regime often wants to get rid of evidence of the previous regime. In fact, that sort of idea of getting rid of evidence of a previous regime actually had a legal representation in the Roman Empire. So there was a legal principle of damnatio memoriae in the Roman Empire, where you could actually, the Senate would actually vote to actually erase any evidence of a previous regime or a particular person for many different reasons. So here we see a fresco where the face of one particular person has been erased, and sometimes they would be painted over with other faces. Perhaps the emperor from the previous emperor's face or statue would be remodeled with the face of the new emperor, just to erase the memory of the previous regime as well. So why are statues toppled, defaced, refaced? All of these different things go on with statues. Why are names changed? Well, again, throughout history, there have been many different reasons. A lot of them have been to do with religion. Apart from the civil regimes, we have the religious regimes as well. So in the Protestant Reformation in Europe, of course, many of the churches, the cathedrals that were in existence at the time, they would have been Catholic. They would have had lots of iconography. They would have had lots of paintings, religious paintings around them. With the Protestant Reformation, we get the removal of the statues, many of the statues, the removal of excessive adornment, the removal, painting over of these paintings. And of course, often when restoration work goes on in these churches and these cathedrals today, evidence of these original decoration is found, and it becomes a debate about whether these things should be completely uncovered and displayed, and whether that actually fits with the religious purposes of these buildings today. In fact, that's another heritage debate, because of course there is a heritage debate when we talk about the repatriation of cultural heritage, about whether all these cathedrals should be given back to the Catholic Church, as they were taken away from the Catholic Church at one point. Also in Asia, we've had that issue in Angkor Wat. Those of you who have visited Angkor will know that, you know, it started off, most of the temples were Hindu temples, and then because of issues with the perception that the Hindu gods had perhaps failed the rulers of Angkor, then they changed to Buddhism, and most of the representations to do with the Hindu gods were removed, and Buddhist images either erected new, as here, or put in place of the original Hindu representations. There are other reasons that statues have been removed. One of the saddest is often the fact that they are often very beautiful, and that means that people want them and they take them. And of course, these are very famous marbles. There's a bit of a dispute about how we should refer to them. Do we refer to them as the Elgin marbles or the Parthenon marbles? The marbles originally were on various buildings. They weren't just on the Parthenon in the Acropolis above Athens in Greece. They were on various buildings. And actually, there was a British Act of Parliament which referred to them as the marbles collected by Lord Elgin. So I suppose these ones in the British Museum probably should be referred to as the Elgin marbles. Again, a very bitter dispute still ongoing about these particular statues, about their removal, the circumstance of their removal, and their continued presence in the British Museum. And of course, in Asia, we've seen that sort of issue going on as well, with regard to, in particular, the looting that went on of various palaces and buildings in China in the 19th century at various times. Of course, these are the famous zodiac heads, or two of the zodiac heads from the fountain, the zodiac fountain at the Old Summer Palace in Beijing. And 1860, of course, it's Lord Elgin's, I'm trying to remember if it's Lord Elgin's son or his grandson who actually leads this force. It's another example of what the French referred to as Elginism, the looting of heritage. And these heads were all removed. If you have visited the Old Summer Palace, and I would recommend you visit the Old Summer Palace, it's still a great sight to see. It's been left in this sort of destroyed state, I think, to make the point about the destruction that went on, the looting and the taking of heritage that went on at that particular time. In fact, the first of the heads to be returned, the Dean actually sent me a notice of this recently, that the first head had actually been returned to the old Summer Palace, with the view that the heads that are now in China will probably be returned to the old Summer Palace to be displayed there. But that's a good reason that statues have been torn down. People wanted them. They saw them as beautiful, as valuable, and they stole them. Other reasons, education. A lot of statues and other representations have been taken at times because it's considered that they are of educational value and they need to be taken elsewhere to educate people. Again, those of you who visited museums in China will often see examples of this. These are the Taichung horses, very famous representations. These are actually on display in Xi'an, again in the Stellai Museum. If you can see the one on the far left, you'll see there's some cracks in that. These two on the far right haven't got any cracks in them, and that's because these are copies. These are not the originals. The one on the far left is an original. The two on the far right are copies, because the originals of these, of course, are in the Penn Museum in the University of Pennsylvania. They were smuggled out of China. They were stolen and smuggled out of China at the beginning of the 20th century. So again, lots of excuses have been given for taking statues. And of course, that looting, that taking of statues is carrying on around Asia even today. Other reasons for destroying, taking down statues, sometimes it can be a social media reason. This was a statue that was erected in China a few years ago, and virtually days after it was erected, it was taken down. We haven't really talked about this, but one issue with statues is that often they're not very aesthetically pleasing. We do get some that are aesthetically pleasing, but this is definitely a statue that was considered, it attracted a lot of social media attention and was removed very quickly. Sometimes statues are just forgotten, and development takes a pace and they are built over. And that seemingly is what happened to this statue, which was uncovered a few months ago in Chongqing. It seems that this statue in the 1970s, 80s was just built over as local developments took place. Now it's been uncovered, and of course people are saying, you know, how could we lose this? How could we lose this statue? But these things happen. The head, by the way, that's one issue. No one knows where the head is. It's just the body of the statue that's been discovered so far. There have been other issues in the history of the damage being done to statues, which again, I think need to be mentioned. One is that sometimes they've been removed or defaced, or other bits of them have been removed because it's been considered that they are morally offensive because of changing views. And this was particularly the case for the classical nude sculptures, particularly coming on from the 17th centuries onwards, and particularly said to be taking place in the 19th century. So we have reference to what's called the Great Castration. Those of you who've seen Tom Hanks in the film Angels and Demons will know that he refers to this as something that was effected by one of the popes, that all of the nude statues in Vatican had various bits of their bodies removed because that particular pope said that they were morally offensive, that they shouldn't be shown. I think there's not much truth, I think, to that particular story. It's much more likely that this was a fig leaf revolution, that statues were covered up when they were considered to be perhaps too risque for the times, even if they were statues of antiquity. We're going to be talking about Queen Victoria very soon. And it's good to mention that Queen Victoria actually had an issue with statues in this way as well. In 1857, she was presented with a statue of Michelangelo's David, a plaster version of it. She was very pleased to get the statue, but she wasn't too happy about the fact that it was on such open display. So she commissioned an artist of the time to not deface it in any way, but to cover it up. So a fig leaf was actually commissioned to actually cover up David so that Queen Victoria wouldn't feel offended by the view. I think the most important issue in recent times when we're talking about people being offended by statues, though, of course, is taking us back to the links to do with slavery, and in particular with the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's the issue of they commemorate what we today would say are unacceptable practices. And for me, last year, this statue really sort of epitomized all of the issues to do with this. So again, I think many people will have seen the statue. It wasn't a statue that I was aware of before, of course, the issues occurred with it. It's a statue of Edward Colston. It's in Bristol. It was in Bristol City. He was a merchant born in the 17th century, born in Bristol, made his fortune from the slave trade, had been an active member of the Royal African Company, and it's been estimated that while he was working with the Royal African Company, some 84,000 people were transported from West Africa to the Americas as slaves. So again, we can see this man has a direct link to the slave trade. However, the reason there is a statue to him, or there was a statue to him in Bristol, was that during his lifetime, he used most of the wealth that he'd made to provide almshouses, hospitals, schools, workhouses, and churches throughout England, but particularly in his home city. So, as I said, I'd never heard of him, but one of my colleagues, Paul Mitchard, who comes from Bristol, of course, said, you know, there were lots of buildings in Bristol. There are still lots of buildings in Bristol, which are called after Colston. He was a very famous local character. And on his death, he left £71,000, which of course was a considerable fortune at the time for various charities, particularly again for the area. In the 19th century, local people saw him as a philanthropist. They saw him as having done such good for the city that a subscription was entered to actually build this statue of him. And it's linked in again to the maritime trade of Bristol as well, which is why you can see the dolphins down at the bottom as well. The statue was erected in 1895 to commemorate him for his philanthropic works. Now, how much people knew about his links to slavery at the time, we know that definitely by the 1920s, local scholars were investigating into this and published about the fact that this man had been very linked into slavery. But of course, again, not much was actually said about this except between local scholars. Because of what had gone on around the world, because of the focus on the issues to do with slavery, and in particular the Black Lives Matter movement, last year, of course, and the preceding couple of years, a lot of focus had been placed on this statue. A lot of times the statue was being defaced, paint daubed upon it, various things put upon it. Artists got involved in trying to tell the story about how this man had actually made his money as well. And I think these are pretty good representations. One artist laid out a lot of figures as if this was actually a slave ship in front of the statue of Colston. And that drew a lot of attention, of course, and a lot of people then questioning why the statue was there. And this is one of my favorites. Another artist knitted a ball and chain in wool and actually attached it to the statue. And again, that drew a lot of attention. And I think this sort of addition to statues is probably a very good way of actually getting debate going about what actually these statues represent, what these people were actually involved in. But of course, the statue became infamous last year because this was the statue where crowds met, pulled the statue down, smashed it, and then threw it into the harbour. Now, of course, later it was recovered from the harbour. It will probably now go and display in a local museum as part of an exhibit explaining about slavery and Bristol's connections to slavery as well. But of course, it attracted a lot of attention because many people said, you know, why have you destroyed it? When I was involved in a discussion of this last year with the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, and we were talking to the various people who were going to speak before in the organisation of this, talking to one of the museum directors who was involved, and he was just saying he was giving his views to it. And for me, I expressed my view that, well, as a lawyer, I think of this as property, of criminal damage and other things. And of course, he instantly said, well, I'd never thought of it as property. I just thought of it as a public representation, and I can understand why people get angered about this. So for lawyers, I think maybe we focus on the property so much that we start to come at it with perhaps different attitudes. The pulling down of this statue, as I said, attracted a lot of attention. Recently, 4 people have been arrested. They've been charged with criminal damage, and that's going to be an interesting trial to see what the focus happens with that particular prosecution. Also, because of this, really because of this one statue, there has been a move by the Conservative government in England to pass a new law to protect Britain's statues, monuments and memorials. There have also been issues with the defacing of war memorials and other figures as well. Whether this law will be effective, how it will actually work, and everything else, well, we'll have to wait and see. So the main reason for the pulling down of statues historically, though, has been for regime change. And we can see that even in name changes as well. So if we think about that, again, as regimes change, we see the change of names. A good example is, of course, in Russia. We get the founding of St. Petersburg in 1703, being called St. Petersburg, various sort of uses of the name, but usually generally St. Petersburg, until 1914, when the name is changed to Petrograd, which of course that's because of the advent of the First World War and the Russians being concerned that St. Petersburg sounds too German, so they change it to Petrograd. 1924, after the revolution and the death of Lenin, we get the change of the name to Leningrad, again distancing from the previous imperial regimes. And then, of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, we get a return to St. Petersburg as well. So we see that names are extremely significant, and the change of names as well. Regimes do try to get rid of evidence of previous regimes, but sometimes they are stopped before they do something too drastic. And this was the case in revolutionary France. Revolutionary France, 1794, there is a proposal by the revolutionary government to remove all Latin inscriptions from public buildings and monuments to erase all evidence of the ancien regime. And the question of how this should be done is given to the Abbé Henri Grégoire. And famously, I think many people know, this is why I think one of the reasons there is a statue to him, or a number of statues to him in France. He came back to the revolutionary government and said, don't do this. This is not the best way to deal with this problem. If you remove this, you are removing memory actually of the ancien regime and some of the bad things that went on then as well. And he successfully lobbied for the protection of most of the evidence of the previous regimes. Of course, subsequent events have lost a lot of France's heritage to do with the ancien regime as well. In China, of course, we saw this with the Cultural Revolution, and of course that focus on, again, removing that evidence of the past, the destruction of the four olds, old ideas, old cultures, old habits, old customs, the removal of images, sculptures, statues of gods, of Confucius, and all those issues that went on during the Cultural Revolution as well. It's a standard thing that goes on when we have new regimes and regimes trying to distance themselves from the old regimes. For colonial associations, again, a lot of former colonies, when they get their independence, immediately want to try and get rid of associations with their colonial past. For India, of course, Bombay, formerly India, an English colony, independence in 1947. Bombay had been called Bombay since about the end of the 16th century because of the influence of European merchants. That had been the name that had been given to it. November 1995, we get a change of the name to Mumbai. And we had a former speaker at one of our seminars who explained that the change in 1995 was considered to be so important that if people in Mumbai were to get letters afterwards, which were actually addressed to them, but mentioned the word Bombay, that the postal service would sort of knock on their door, show them the letter, and then tear it up because the wrong name was being used. And that's important sometimes it is to distance yourself to previous names. For China, I think Beijing, the name Beijing was adopted in the early 1400s, but the Europeans, of course, with their pronunciation would often refer to it as Peking from the end of, well, mid to the 18th century onwards. And of course, 1958, the PRC adopted the use of the spelling Beijing. This was what should be used for within China. And shortly afterwards, they said this is what should be used outside of China as well. So names are often very important to signify this changing and moving away as well. Statues, well, let's get back to Victoria because we're going to come to Hong Kong's Victoria very soon. But if we're thinking about former colonies, then of course Ireland is probably a very important one for the British to think about. Ireland was England's first colony, and this was a statue that was erected in 1908 outside Leinster House in Dublin. Of course, with the Civil War, the move to Irish independence, by 1922, the Irish Parliament was now situated in this building, and people started to question whether you should actually have a statue of Queen Victoria outside a building which is really moving towards Irish independence. The Irish Free State, it continued to be there. It was removed in 1948, which was at the time just before the Republic was actually formed. The Republic of Ireland was formed. It was removed. And then there was a problem. They didn't destroy it. There could, of course, have been a melting down of the statue or whatever else. But actually, Ireland started to negotiate with other, with Commonwealth jurisdictions to see if anyone wanted this statue of Victoria. There were moves to move it to Canada at one point, but the Canadian authorities couldn't raise the money to actually ship it. As you can see, it is a colossal statue. In fact, in the end, an agreement was come to in 1986 with the city of Sydney, and it's now on permanent loan outside the Queen Victoria building in Sydney. I think it's interesting to say that it's on permanent loan, because does that mean that the Irish actually, the Republic of Ireland actually wants the statue of Victoria back? Anyway, it's on permanent loan in Sydney. And of course, other jurisdictions have dealt with their colonial statues in different ways. Again, going back to India, if we think about New Delhi, then again, they didn't destroy the statues. They moved them away from those public places where they would be in everyone's face every day and put them into a park, the Coronation Park in New Delhi. People are, can go and wander there and still see their heritage and their history. So that really brings us on to that question: is the loss of statues, names, and cultural heritage an issue? One thing that's often been raised is, look, most of the time we don't even notice statues. And for me, when I thought about this, I think of being brought up in London. There are lots of statues in London. There are many more statues in London than there are in Hong Kong. There were many statues I would pass in London that I probably never noticed. And that's been an argument both for the removal of them, because people don't really notice them, so why shouldn't we get rid of them? But also for the idea that, well, if they're not really being noticed, they're not offending anyone, why shouldn't we keep them as well? When I was thinking about London and I was thinking of the statues I did remember, of course, the statue of Nelson in Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, the one which I showed you earlier, of course, that was one I can always remember as a child seeing. And this one always came to mind as well. Again, if you go to London, I think it's one of the best statues in London. It's a statue of, we used to call it Boadicea, and it's on the, next to Westminster Bridge, on the embankment there. It links into Queen Victoria, by the way, because Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were talking to the sculptor of this. They were instrumental in the actual design of this particular statue. In fact, there's an idea that Victoria liked to think of herself as a sort of a Boadicea type character. I'm not too sure how that works. But for me, when I was young, this was one of my favorite statues that I could remember in London. I think it's interesting as well because it's one of the few representations of a woman, apart from statues of, say, Queen Victoria and some of our other members of our royal family. But it's also, I suppose, it's quite an active statue. It's quite aesthetically pleasing in many ways as well. Of course, Boadicea, issues with how she was treated by the Romans, and of course how she treated the Romans subsequently as well. So I'm hopeful that no one in Italy starts a movement to actually get rid of Boadicea because of the terrible things she did to Romans. The question of whether these statues matter, I think, was addressed by George Orwell in 1984. And again, this is a quote that's been put forward many times in recent times to do with heritage, with statues, and with things like the burning of books as well. In 1984, of course, Orwell is commenting on that all-powerful state and how they try to rewrite history. And he says, he tried to make her understand this was an exceptional case. It wasn't just a question of somebody being killed. Do you realize that the past, starting from yesterday, has been actually abolished? If it survives anywhere, it's in a few solid objects with no words attached to them. Already we know almost literally nothing about the revolution and the years before the revolution. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street and building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And that process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. I know, of course, that the past is falsified, but it would never be possible for me to prove it, even when I did the falsification myself. After the thing is done, no evidence ever remains. The only evidence is inside my own mind. And I don't know with any certainty that any other human being shares my memories. So this has been used many times. Orwell, of course, was frightened very much about the state doing this. In recent times, we've seen what are referred to as popular movements, although how popular they actually are is questionable, in actually removing these statues or lobbying for the removing of these statues, renaming the things as well. So, have we got threats to statues, names, and cultural heritage in Hong Kong? Well, there is a threat to statues in Hong Kong, and that mostly comes from trading in statues in Hong Kong. If we go to Hollywood Road, we'll see many shops selling statues. I'm sure they're all obtained legitimately, but of course there is a question mark about what sort of a threat this is to the heritage of our neighbouring jurisdictions. In Hong Kong, one of the questions I suppose to do with issues with our monuments and our statues is, do we have any monuments which actually commemorate anything that's unacceptable? In particular, because of the focus on slavery in recent years, anything to do with slavery in Hong Kong? Well, there are no statues that I'm aware of or monuments that commemorate a sort of a pro-slavery approach. In fact, we really should have some monuments to those who are opposed to slavery in Hong Kong, because of course many people will know that the first ordinance that was ever passed in Hong Kong was actually an ordinance to stop slavery. When the British came to Hong Kong, 1844, the first ordinance, if you go to Legco, they've got a framed copy of it there. The first ordinance was to stop slavery being carried out in Hong Kong. Why? Well, because slavery was prevalent throughout Asia at the time, and of course, particularly in China. And the practices had been imported into Hong Kong as well. And there was concern that this should be stopped. Now, of course, this ordinance didn't actually become law in Hong Kong, because when it was sent back to Britain, of course, then the ministers involved immediately said, well, hold on, we've got the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. There is no slavery in the British Empire, so we don't need this particular law in Hong Kong. But of course, the practice did continue, particularly the practice of Mui Tsai, the little sisters. And as I said, maybe we should have some monuments to those who try to fight against this, both Chinese and European. The nearest we've got is, of course, to the governor, John Pope Hennessy, who spoke out against the practice, was opposed by British merchants who said, don't interfere. We want trade to continue, so don't interfere in local practices. John Pope Hennessy, of course, today, I think only commemorated in things like the Hennessy Road, one of the most unpopular governors in his lifetime, and of course, no commemorations during his lifetime. The other character, I suppose, linked into the abolition of slavery in Hong Kong is Winston Churchill. It's always difficult to have memorials to Churchill for many different reasons. Hong Kong's got some bitter sort of sweet memories of Churchill's orders as well. But there are no memorials that I know of to Churchill in Hong Kong, except one bar in Wan Chai, and I'm not sure that's really, well, considering his drinking habits, perhaps he would have agreed with this as well. Perhaps our biggest problem, something that would be considered unacceptable today, is our links to opium. And of course, there are strong links to opium in Hong Kong. In fact, that is the reason that the British took Hong Kong as a colony, really, to protect the opium trade in the first Opium War. So we can say that our harbour, in a way, is a memorial to the opium trade. We might always point to associations like the noonday gun, which of course is fired by a representative of Jardines. And of course, from the 1860s, this practice was carried out. It's linked into, there are various different stories, perhaps the welcoming of the taipan of the house in a gun should have been fired. Apparently the British Navy weren't happy with this, and in the end Jardines started firing a gun every day at noon just to, I think, show their independence from the British Navy in many ways. So Jardines, of course, a trading house very much linked to opium as well. So perhaps we need to think about identifying these factors. This particular gun, by the way, isn't the original, of course. That was taken by the Japanese during the Second World War. This one was actually presented to Jardines in 1961. Apart from that, this is a link to Hong Kong's opium past. The exterior of the main building of the University of Hong Kong. This is a declared monument by the colonial administration in 1984. Of course, why? Why would this have a link to opium? Well, it's because of this particular gentleman, H.N. Modi, who, of course, donated the money for the building of the building. And, of course, he had made most of his money from opium. He was an opium auctioneer as well. So, again, lots of links to do with the opium trade. Have we got any issues to do with the political use of statues or monuments in Hong Kong? Well, possibly our oldest monument, Song Wong Tai, the rock that was originally on the Sacred Hill, The rock, which is of course referred to as the Terrace of the Sung King, which was engraved with the name, with this dedication to the Sung King at that particular time, meant to have visited Hong Kong for a number of years, meant to have actually gone and sat on this terrace and looked out over the sea, and engraved with this particular memorial shortly after his death. The issue here, of course, is the fact that the inscription actually says the Terrace of the Sung King, and the character used for king is a character which in its pronunciation in Cantonese is the same as the term emperor, but of course the people at the time probably used the character for king because they didn't want to offend the Mongol rulers of the time. So statues always have a political element. Any memorial usually has a political element, and I think we had that with Sun Won Tai as well. And Sun Won Tai is our example of the first protection of monuments and statues in Hong Kong. The first ordinance to actually protect a particular piece of our heritage is the 1899 Sun Won Tai Reservation Ordinance, which was to protect the sacred hill, the land around it, and the Sun Won Tai rock as well. The big change to do with Hong Kong statues, the big effect in the colonial administration days, of course, was the Second World War. Second World War, of course, saw a big changes for our heritage in Hong Kong. When it came to names and statues, well, when the Japanese took over in 1941, they immediately started to rename many streets, places, and buildings. And there are a few examples for you there. Of course, we had Statue Square at that time. We still have Statue Square today. Statue Square contained many more statues at the time. Here's a representation of some of them. On the far left, you can see the sort of pagoda-like structure where Queen Victoria's statue would have been contained. There were statues elsewhere as well. There was a statue of Sir Arthur Kennedy, one of the most popular governors, I think the only governor to ever get a statue during his lifetime erected to him, which was in the Botanical Gardens. And of course, with the advent of the Second World War, or the impact of it, there were attempts made to try and protect some of these statues. At the time, when the Japanese invaded, there were these 10 statues actually in Statue Square. And of course, immediately they were subject to, well, many of them were just torn down at the time. During the Second World War, most of them were shipped back to Japan. Various fates awaited them to be melted down and used because of their valuable metals, with the main one. Here we see Victoria awaiting shipment. On the left, we've got, I think that one's Stephen, of the 2 HSBC lines. Both of those were removed and sent back to Japan as well, with the intention of melting them down. After the Second World War, well, there were issues to do with Japanese statues and Japanese monuments as well. In particular, the Japanese War Memorial, which we can see at the top of the picture in this blurry picture here. Here's a closer representation of it. A war memorial built by the Japanese during their occupation of Hong Kong, often said to have been a place which was intended to be a last stand position for the Japanese, when they knew that the days in Hong Kong were numbered as well. After the Second World War, big debate about what should happen. General consensus, let's get rid of it. We want to get rid of that memory of the Japanese in Hong Kong. It took a lot of destruction. It was eventually torn down, but as you see that base there, parts of that base are still existing if you do go to try and look at the structure today. Other issues to do with our heritage, well, of course, Sun Won Tai itself and the Sacred Hill. The Sacred Hill had been leveled for the extension of the Kai Tak Airport, and the rock, the Sun Won Tai rock, had actually been partially destroyed. Luckily, the majority of the inscription actually remained, and afterwards, again, a debate about what should happen. Eventually, of course, this was cut away and is now in its own small park in Kowloon. With the bronze statues, though, the only ones to be recovered, Stephen and Stitt, are now back outside the HSBC building in Central. The story is that an American soldier discovered them in the Kawasaki dockyard in Osaka at the end of the Second World War, and they were returned. They were recognized as where they'd come from, and they were returned to Hong Kong in 1946. The statue of Victoria was also returned as well, and in 1955 was put in its present position in Victoria Park. It was sculpted by Mario Raggi, as it says there, who actually sculpted a number of figures of Victoria, very similar figures. There was one in Toronto and one in Kimberley as well. And of course, he also sculpted this figure, which is the only other figure from Statue Square to be recovered, which is the only one now standing in Statue Square. And that's the one of Sir Thomas Jackson, the former head of the HSBC. Later statues were erected after the Second World War. The statue of King George VI is often said to have been erected in 1941 because it commemorates the 100th anniversary of Hong Kong. But it wasn't, because of course it would have then been removed by the Japanese. It was erected in 1958, but it does commemorate the 100th anniversary. It's actually been erected in the same spot as the statue of Sir Arthur Kennedy in the Botanical Gardens. And another famous statue, of course, is that which commemorates the death of John Robert Osborne, Victoria Cross, who was killed on 19 December 1941 defending Hong Kong against the Japanese. It's not a statue of John Robert Osborne. It's a statue of a First World War soldier. It was actually part of the collection of the Yuen family. It was donated by them to the Osborne Barracks in Kowloon in the 1980s. And then with the closure of the barracks, it was removed to Hong Kong Park in the 1990s, where it stands today. So what legal protection for statues is there in Hong Kong? Well, unless there's a specific ordinance, as in the Song Won Toi Reservation Ordinance, which of course doesn't work today because the Song Won Toi Reservation is gone, and of course the Song Won Toi Rock has now been moved and is in its own small park, as I mentioned earlier. We're really looking at the criminal law. Criminal damage is the main sort of protection, and issues to do with property law. Apart from that, we do have our 1976, our Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance, which came into effect in 1976. So the Act was actually gazetted in 1971, but came into effect in 1976. It offers two forms of protection for our monuments. First, as a relic or an antiquity, and second, as declaration as a monument. So antiquity, relic, well, these are, an antiquity is a relic itself or a place, building, site or structure erected before the year 1800. A relic is a movable object made, shaped, painted, carved, inscribed, or otherwise created before the year 1800. So we're looking for anything pre-1800. And of course, in Hong Kong, well, we're probably only looking at the Song Won Toi Rock. It's probably the only thing we can actually identify that could be classified as a relic or an antiquity in Hong Kong. Monuments in Hong Kong, the specification there is that we can have declaration as a monument. Also for emergency protection as a proposed monument. That's only happened 5 times in Hong Kong's history since this provision was actually introduced in 1992. Generally quite successful in protecting monuments, possibly the most unsuccessful the time it was used for Ho Tung Gardens. But generally, apart from that, quite a successful means of protection for our monuments. The Declaration of Monuments, well, the Secretary for Development, after consultation with the Antiquities Advisory Board and with the approval of the Chief Executive, can actually declare any place, building, site or structure as being a monument in Hong Kong. Other forms of protection outside of this, well, if it's not a relic, if it's not an antiquity, if it's not a monument, if it's not guarded by any other specific legislation, there is this designation on the Antiquities and Monuments Office records as a government historic site, which doesn't seem to provide any legal protection. There is the Antiquities Advisory Board grading system, which is not a statutory protection. It's purely administrative in its nature, in identifying heritage. So there doesn't seem to be much protection apart from that. In fact, if we're thinking about the colonial times in Hong Kong and the protection that was afforded to our monuments then, the only one of our statues that really we can point to as being protected, well, those attached to buildings that were protected. So here in 1984, we get the declaration of the exterior of the old Supreme Court as a monument. And of course, that means, therefore, that the statue of Themis of Justice and the Royal Coat of Arms, in theory, are protected under that designation. In fact, the colonial administration's attitude to statues to heritage, they were generally not that bothered. If we look at the introduction of the Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance, it took 26 years for this to become effective. Again, possibly spurred on by what was happening in China in 1976 at the end of the Cultural Revolution. Perhaps that's why it actually came into effect at that time. The colonial administration, not that bothered about heritage at all. In fact, 1984, the Sino-British Joint Declaration led again to this idea that I think the colonial administration had always had, that Hong Kong was a borrowed place. So they weren't really that worried about it. The number of declared monuments, though, by the end of the 1980s, in 1989, we see a sudden increase in the number of declared monuments. We get 25 monuments being declared between 1989 and 1997, 17 of which were linked to the colonial era. And of course, there is that question of, I wonder whether the administration was starting to think maybe we need to protect some of these things before Hong Kong goes back to China. So the governor's residence, and of course the old Marine headquarters compound down in TST, which had been the scene of a lot of protests when the colonial administration originally were going to level that particular compound, the hill that it was on as well, but then was declared a monument in 1994. Today, of course, it's controversial as Heritage 1881, which is often referred to as Disney Heritage. And of course, its name itself is a bit of a problem because the building was completed in 1884, so it should be Heritage 1884. But of course, the number 4 in Cantonese is not particularly lucky, so maybe that's why they chose 1881. 1997, there were concerns that the colonial heritage would be effaced in some way. Even before the new administration took over, there'd been an attack on the Victoria statue. You may remember this, red paint poured over it. The artist actually struck the figure with a hammer and disfigured Victoria more than normal. And there were issues. You know, he described it as performance art. Some people said it was patriotic. The majority of people in Hong Kong just called it criminal damage. And again, seeing this particular image reminded me of something that happened last year in Leeds, where again, the statue of Victoria was defaced by the Black Lives Matters movement, and amid accusations that Victoria was a slave owner as well. So issues about this colonial heritage, whether the new administration would eradicate it. And of course, the question arose, well, why not? You know, most changes we've seen to do with former colonies have involved the removal of any evidence of the colonial administration. Actually, there didn't seem to be too much of a move towards this by the new administration. They declared 19 new monuments from 1997 to 2006, which included some colonial buildings. Of course, one of them, the Morrison building, had links to the 1949 revolution. So of course, that was possibly the reason that that was chosen, but that's understandable as well. They did also buy the Kom Tong Hall, which is a very important colonial building as well, in 2003. But apart from that, probably they continued to ignore heritage as much as they possibly could, much in line with the colonial administration, except of course with the Victoria Harbour, because we had lots of protests to do with the reclamation of the harbour, and that was the biggest problem for them until 2007. And 2007 really became a year where there were many problems for the administration in Hong Kong because of their treatment of heritage. The focus, of course, was on the Star Ferry Pier in 2006 and the Queen's Pier in 2007. And here's a picture of Queen's Pier. It's not the prettiest of buildings. We can't call it too aesthetically pleasing, I don't think. But of course, it was extremely symbolic to the people of Hong Kong. It had seen the arrival of all the governors since 1925. Queen Elizabeth II in 1975. It was named after Queen Victoria. It had significance as well for the people of Hong Kong, possibly for the colonial administration. They had announced very soon after 1997 that the pier would be removed, that it was going to be demolished. But when they did announce in 2003 to 4 that they were going to do this, opposition arose. There was opposition to the removal of the Star Ferry Pier, and then there was occupation of the pier at one point, the Queen's Pier. Lots of issues going on. The Secretary of Development at the time, Carrie Lam, said she would not give the people false hope about holding on to the pier. In fact, in the end, of course, police officers had to evict protesters from the pier amid these sort of violent scenes of people chaining themselves to the pier as well. I think this all took the government by surprise, which means that post-2007, there was actually a lot done by the government to concede to this public opinion, including the fact that, of course, they decided not to destroy the pier, that it was actually dismantled, and a promise, still an ongoing promise, that it will be reassembled in the future. There may also have been a slight change to do with declared monuments since 2007 as well, because we've had 44 monuments declared since that period, many of them being colonial buildings, of course, many of them linked to revolutionary characters such as Sun Yat-sen as well, but some of them very colonial, as is shown on that slide there, including, of course, this one, which is the cenotaph, which I think is, we can still probably call it a statue in some ways, and of course is the only one of Hong Kong's statues in its own right to have monument status, and the only one, by the way, in Statue Square. Originally, this would have been considered to be in Statue Square. And 2013, the colonial administration declared this a monument as well. Subsequently, of course, there were a number of problems to do with heritage in Hong Kong that the colonial administration still had to face. 2015, we had the issues to do with our post boxes, with the royal ciphers, which were on the post boxes. Hong Kong Post announced they were going to erase them or cover them up, and the people of Hong Kong just said, why? And people got very angry about this. And of course, again, the government, Hong Kong Post, had to give in. It's a very unusual thing with heritage, but I think there has been this general idea that when people get angry about the heritage, the government is far more willing to give in on these things than they would be to concede on these than they would be on many other matters. We saw this with announcements that we'd have renaming of roads in Hong Kong. Certain people put forward, we should get rid of Queen's Road Central. Let's have something, far more linked into Hong Kong now as part of the PLC in the naming. Again, people got very angry about this. And of course, there was a retreat from any idea of this very quickly. The law on renaming, by the way, the Director of Lands can rename any street in Hong Kong using this particular process. There's no public consultation, but there has to be a public announcement. There is an appeals process by way to the authority, the Director of Lands, and also to the Municipal Services Appeals Board as well. But generally, I think the decision of the authority would be pretty final if they did decide to do this. And there is also a penalty, by the way, for displaying names which are not the names of particular streets, the authorized names as well, which again is quite interesting when we consider the ideas that people have put forward for renaming certain streets. This restriction on using different names doesn't extend to other examples of our heritage. So let's go back to the Victoria Harbour as well, because this is the Victoria Harbour, but is often today referred to as the Harbour. And one former chief executive didn't like anyone to refer to it as the Victoria Harbour. This is probably one element of Hong Kong's colonial heritage that possibly is under threat, the name of the Victoria Harbour. Other issues that have arisen, 2017, we had this very strange sight. You may just see behind there the statue of Queen Victoria in Victoria Park. President Xi was visiting, and the organisers of this particular event thought they'd better obscure the view because it might offend President Xi. Even the Hong Kong government, when the public said, what are you doing? Even the Hong Kong government ordered the organisers to take these sort of obstructions down. Again, this idea that why are we hiding the heritage? We've got various new statues in Hong Kong. We have very few statues though generally, and they're not very diverse or representative in many ways. Chinese statues, probably Sun Yat-sen, a number of him, of course, this one outside the Compton Hall, the Sun Yat-sen Museum, and of course Bruce Lee, which is probably one of our most famous statues in Hong Kong. Still issues with some of our statues, not so much the ones that are public as such, but if you visit King Yin Lee, one of our declared monuments in Hong Kong, a great property to go and visit, you may see this particular statue, which again is probably uncomfortable in present day because this is a blackamoor figure. These were traditionally Venetian figures representative of black slaves in Venice as well. So again, maybe I'm not calling for these things to be removed, but perhaps some sort of education on what these things actually represent. Statue Square itself, well, it doesn't have very many statues anymore. Occasionally we get these sorts of things, which are probably very emblematic of Hong Kong. It's all about business, isn't it? But there's only one statue now really in Statue Square, which is the statue of Sir Thomas Jackson, and of course the cenotaph, and then of course the figure of justice on the Supreme Court building, but we don't have that many. We have the big Buddha that was erected under the colonial administration. That's one of our most famous. And of course we have Guanyin in Tai Po, just near to the university now as well. We see lots of religious linked statues, but these are in one of the temples in Sheng Shui, which I was surprised to see because of course these are the zodiac heads from the zodiac fountain in the old Summer Palace. And of course the issue here is, well, I know they can be linked to the temple, but they seem more political in their display than any other purpose. And other political messages, well, we have the Comfort Woman statues down on the walkway in Central. We have the new statue of Sun Yat-sen in the Sun Yat-sen Park. And of course, CUHK, we have the Goddess of Democracy outside our MTR station as well. Statues, of course, often political. And of course, because of that, I wonder if that's why there's a move towards abstract statues a lot of the time in public places, because it takes away some of the controversy. What is the future for Hong Kong's colonial heritage? Well, there's still been calls at times to decolonize Hong Kong. We saw this back in 2018. The government very quickly answered and said, no, we're not changing street names. We're not removing royal ciphers on post boxes. Don't worry. I think that's the Hong Kong government again saying this is something we can easily do, and we can keep people quiet if we do this sort of thing as well. And that sort of idea of the Hong Kong people really caring about their heritage, I think we saw that very recently with the discovery of this water temple, as it's been described in Sham Shui Po, in the area that's been referred to as Bishop's Hill. Photos went viral of this. It went on all the social media, on the news, in the newspapers, because, of course, government workers had started to demolish this particular building. Some local people got in, took photographs. There's some wonderful 360-degree photographs on social media if you check up as well. And people immediately said, what are you doing? Why are you getting rid of this? It became quite an embarrassment for the government, for the Antiquities and Monuments Office and the Antiquities Advisory Board as well. Although, of course, to be fair to them, they probably just didn't even know this was there. It was probably a different government department. The government immediately said, don't worry, we won't demolish it, we'll even rebuild it, which is very unusual for a government response to public outcry. As I was looking into this and looking for photographs of Hong Kong's heritage, it actually alerted me to some issues going on in other Asian jurisdictions to do with colonial heritage, particularly in links to Hong Kong as well, because one of the heritage expert that is on Twitter, and I follow her on Twitter, is Phanom Van, and she had posted on her Twitter feed these photographs of a statue of Queen Victoria. So she's kindly allowed me to use them. She took some better photographs. These are the best she could do from a hotel window where she was in Bangkok. Of this statue of Queen Victoria, it's very similar to our statue. It's not by the same sculptor. This was on the site of the UK's Bangkok embassy, which Boris Johnson sold off for a colossal sum back in 2018. But when he sold it, and a shopping centre, Bangkok needs more shopping centres, is going to be developed on this particular site, there then became an issue. The local people said, what happens to our statue? The local sort of British community were worried, but actually local people were quite worried about this as well. Again, I think it was one of those things that's accepted as part of their heritage. And the developers are now guaranteed that the statue will somehow be incorporated into the shopping centre. Possibly Queen Victoria would not have been amused by that one. But again, looking into this, I didn't realise there is another statue of Queen Victoria in Thailand. It was originally outside the British consulate up in Chiang Mai. It's been moved from there into the cemetery now, and it's on display there. The reason being, there was an idea that it was going to be got rid of when the consulate closed in 1978. But the local people didn't like this because, again, they said this is part of our cultural heritage. And actually, there was a bit of a cult towards Queen Victoria, because you may know that Queen Victoria had 9 children. So locals had considered that she's a bit of a fertility goddess in some ways. It's very strange to think of Victoria in those terms, but again, it's incredible how when these statues often, I think, maybe are not noticed, but when people go to get rid of them, then people start to worry about this, the loss of their heritage, of their history. Again, other issues in Asia we've seen dealt with in different ways. So Taiwan dealt with issues to do with Chiang Kai-shek and the statues they had there, by again moving them into a park, an area. They didn't destroy them, they didn't get rid of them, they moved them into an area. They weren't always on public display. And other issues on a lighter note to say about the issues to do with statues. It's often when you erect a statue that it causes more problems. We've seen that in China with a number of statues. So you may have seen these stories about various theme parks in China putting up statues, replicas of various heritage monuments, not Iron Man. Disney probably aren't too pleased about that, but you can probably do a deal with Disney. But Egypt was very unhappy about this portrayal of the Sphinx. There's another theme park that's got a representation of Angkor Wat, and the Cambodian authorities are not very happy about that. Another issue that arose when I was looking into the statues is a warning. If you go to look at the statue of Bruce Lee, I'm not too sure what the government mean by this, but actually embedded in one of the stars on that walkway is this statue, is this particular star, warning you about the dangers of statues. So be careful of statues. And again, I think my general idea is that I think we don't want to get rid of our heritage without thinking about this and being very careful about what we do with these statues, about removing them. as evidence of our history, of our past. But I'm not advocating an unquestioning respect for statues. So I'm sure Winston Churchill wouldn't be happy with me sitting on his knee. But again, you know, statues generally form a bit of everyday life. If you are worried about losing any evidence of Hong Kong's colonial past, then I should point out that you may actually be carrying evidence of Hong Kong's colonial past with you today. Just look in your pocket, because occasionally you still find one of our coins in Hong Kong with a portrayal of Queen Elizabeth II on these as well. Of course, they're becoming fewer and fewer. And finally, as I said, I'm not that worried too much about Hong Kong's colonial heritage for the future, because I believe that the people of Hong Kong really care about it. I'm much more concerned about heritage, about statues, about our history outside of Hong Kong for many reasons. And this is one of the reasons I worry about this, is recent stories to do with issues linked into what's called colonial shame and the ideas of unacceptable, people being unacceptable because of quite distant links to unacceptable practices. So you may have seen these stories to do with authors, famous authors like Graham Greene, George Orwell, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the fact that their families may have received payouts on the abolition of slavery because their families, some generations before, would have been linked to slavery. That's meant that the British Library has now said that George Orwell, well, his books in some ways perhaps have to carry a warning that they could in some ways offend people because of his family's links to these particular things. And that worries me because, as I said earlier, Orwell was always worried about the rewriting of history. He was worried about states doing this. We can see this being done in a sort of a, well, almost, I was going to say a subtle way, but it's not that subtle way today. And perhaps that's why it's best to leave Orwell with the final words. This is a statue outside the BBC of Orwell, where some words that he put up, which really I think are very important when we consider some of these embarrassing, awkward, uncomfortable aspects of our heritage today. These words were meant to be included in the foreword to Animal Farm, but were never included. But he said, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. When it comes to our heritage and our statues, I think that's the point. We may find them uncomfortable, but sometimes perhaps we need to have that discomfort. Thank you very much. I think I'm just within time.
Thank you very much, Steve. This was, as expected, very informative, entertaining, and just great. Thank you very much. Before I open the floor for questions, I should mention what I'd forgotten to mention earlier. Professor Steve Gallagher is, of course, also the co-founder and the co-organizer of the Greater China Legal Histories seminar series, which is very important, I think. Now, if you have any questions, please send us a chat. Use the chat function. And while waiting for incoming questions, may I ask the first question, please? When looking at Hong Kong, do you think that from a legal perspective, from the legal regime perspective, does any changes required? And if so, what do you think should be done in order to address all those issues that you have mentioned during the talk today?
Well, as I said, I'm quite positive about Hong Kong's colonial heritage. Apart from sort of mistakes that go on with regard to that water temple recently, a lot of colonial buildings have been declared as monuments. For our statues, though, I think it's noticeable that not many of them have been, as I said. They're often in areas which are protected in different ways under parks legislation, but perhaps some sort of direct protection might send a message, but perhaps that's the issue as with the post boxes. When there was a move to remove the royal ciphers from the post boxes, there was counter suggestions that perhaps they should all be declared as monuments in Hong Kong. And of course, I think that became quite embarrassing for the Secretary of Development at that point. Possibly the best thing that could happen is an overhaul of our heritage legislation. In Hong Kong, we've only got that Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance. We've got provision for heritage impact assessments under the Environmental Impact Assessment Ordinance as well, but perhaps a revision of that old legislation which was introduced by a colonial administration, which, to be fair, didn't really care. That was really from public pressure and one governor who I think had sort of championed this particular event as well. So perhaps some overall of the general legislation would be a best thing to happen.
Thank you. There's one question here. You mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, which has affected, which has led to activities in many countries in the world. Did that in any effect also lead to activities in Hong Kong?
I think only with the popular protests, I think there were links to do with this, but not really to do with our statues. I mean, it made, with my students, when we discuss this, it made us think about our statues and start to think about what sort of protection is there for our statues. But as I said, Hong Kong's links to slavery, I'm sure if we dig deep enough, there will be some links to slavery there, but I'm not too sure we can actually point to any of those figures. As I mentioned, the defacing of the statue in Leeds of Queen Victoria referred to her as a slave owner. There is an allegation that she owned a slave, but the accepted view of the history is actually that she freed a young lady who had been given to her by a Yoruba, a young lady who had been given to her, and she became almost her ward and she looked after her. But of course, again, I suppose that's open to the interpretation of these particular movements. So I don't think Black Lives Matter would really affect us too much in Hong Kong. There could be issues with other movements linked into these other unacceptable practices then.
A question, I think, which, well, let me go to the question which I just received. Thank you very much for the interesting lecture. Problems with the post-colonial statues in Hong Kong are in a way similar to the problem with post-communist monuments in Poland. And I think this question comes from Poland. The old regimes are passing away and the new authorities do not want monuments that remind them of their predecessors. Does legislation explicitly mandate the removal of post-colonial heritage, monument streets and square names?
It doesn't in Hong Kong. I mean, it just comes under these general provisions. So to do with the names, as I said, the requisite authority there can decide to change a name. He would have to publish this. He'd have to publish it in the Government Gazette. He'd have to put notices up in that particular area to say that the names were being changed. With our statues, as I said, we haven't really had that sort of a problem. The only issues we've ever had with our statues of our colonial figures, I think, is really the defacing of Queen Victoria by that artist. And of course, the issue in 2017 when the boards were put up around this, which again, many people in Hong Kong, and I think many members of the Hong Kong government thought was quite ridiculous anyway. It was more embarrassing than anything else. I'm not sure that President Xi would have been that bothered at all about this. When we see how colonial heritage is used in China as part of a narrative, and is often protected in China as part of that narrative as well, and I don't think there's a problem. The dimension of the sort of the former Soviet bloc countries and the issues that have come up there, I mean, that's been a big issue in Russia now that many people are regretting the fact that many of the statues from the communist era have been torn down. You know, the images of Stalin, of Lenin and other things were just torn down, were scrapped. There were pictures of scrapyards with these statues being destroyed or whatever else. And again, that idea of everyone acted in haste. And that's often been the thing, I think, with the end of particular regimes, that afterwards people regret the loss of that.
We have a question from Sarah Ward, who is with the Dalian Maritime University in China. Thanks for a fantastic presentation. From a heritage practitioner point of view, we often do a social assessment to determine both the overall social significance of heritage items in those communities for sub-communities that have close association for the particular heritage item. If the law doesn't recognize social significance per se, do you think that a social assessment may be a useful tool for lawyers to use when making a case for protection of former monuments?
Thank you very much, Sarah, for tuning in. It's nice to have you here. Yes, I think so. I mean, actually, the legislation for the Declaration of Monuments in Hong Kong allows that our Secretary for Development will consider a number of factors. And of course, you'll be aware from the heritage impact assessments as well that some of those factors can be considered. But perhaps expressly putting that into into new legislation would again help. If it was a lawyer making an argument, I think that would be something to put forward, the social value of retaining sculptures and monuments. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question from Cyril Ma. Is there any information about colonial heritage in a more local, at a more local level that's not one of the major sites? For example, the questioner grew up around Shonli Estate in the Jordan Valley. There aren't a lot of colonial buildings. A few years ago, however, the estate's founding plaque, which mentions Governor McLeod, has disappeared. Not sure whether or not there is some sort of push or understanding in the larger conservation circles about these smaller issues.
I haven't heard, I mean, I've heard certain groups in Hong Kong, there are groups in the social media who are worried about some of these things and want to promote the fact that there's this local history. And of course, there are a number of local archaeologists and historians who promote that sort of local history as well. And I think, you know, if there was a legal aspect, we'd always be happy to hear from people who wanted to talk about some of these things as well. With that removal of things like that particular plaque and some of the metal plaques that have been removed in Hong Kong. At one point, I was told by someone that they suspected some sort of nefarious plan to remove some of this evidence. I think it's far more prosaic. I think the shame of the fact is that often these metal plaques are taken because they're valuable for their metal. That's all.
We have one more short question from Peter Gregoire. Great presentation. Do we make enough use of our statues in Hong Kong for educational purposes?
I can't speak from the perspective of the schools. I know there are certain tours that take place in Hong Kong, but I think that's a good point, Gregor. I think we could definitely use more of that because, again, you know, just briefly looking into this as I did, it was interesting to see what had happened with those various statues. Even if we think again of the monument of Wong Toi, of its history as well, of what had happened to it, it's quite interesting to see how it was first put up, why it was put up, why it was inscribed, what had gone on at that time, then to think about the first protection it was given. Why, if we look at the Hansard reports of that particular ordinance being discussed, it's interesting to see these sort of colonial administrators discussing why that rock should be protected, referring back to the fact that actually in the negotiations for the 1860 treaty, that the Chinese officials at the time had said to them, we want you to protect the rock as well. So all of these things I'd not known about. I thought that was really interesting. And I think there would be a good way of talking a little bit more about Hong Kong's history, using this heritage, using the statues as well.
Well, thank you very much again to you for this fantastic presentation. Many thanks also to all of you for joining today. Before I close, I would like to let you know about the upcoming seminars that we are organizing. The next Greater China Legal History seminar will take place on the 26th of February 2021. We have 3 experts, Ms. Lillian Chung from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Professor Xi Chao from CUHK Law, and Professor Christian Hoffman from the National University of Singapore, talking about the history of central banking in Hong Kong, mainland China, and Singapore. Next, we have as a seminar of the Legal Thinkers seminar series, Professor Eva Bills, who is a professor of law at King's College London and a former colleague of ours, of course, Ronald Dworkin's Liberal Theory of Law in an Era of Rising Authoritarianism, on the 28th of January, 5 to 6 p.m. And we have on the 5th of February 2021, 9 a.m. Hong Kong time, an online talk by our colleague Jae-Won Lee, Michelle Dai, La Lin, oh God, this is difficult to pronounce, somebody from Thailand, and David Dual about aviation law and policy in Asia, smart regulation in liberalized markets. This is actually a book talk, a book that has been published. Thank you very much for joining today. Many thanks to Steve again, and we hope to see you soon again. We are CUHK Law. Bye-bye.